Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm a professional pumpkin carver from the UK. In this video, I'm going to take a look at this wired video and offer my opinion on some of the things which are covered in this. I'm also going to draw and carve my own version of the dragon pumpkin from this video. I'm going to sculpt a pumpkin for the very first time, and I'm going to look at some advanced carving principles that will allow anyone to improve their own pumpkin carving. Now, if you search how to carve a pumpkin on YouTube, there seems to be a sea of content of people trying to teach you how to carve a pumpkin that don't really know how to carve a pumpkin. With the exception of one video which I came across, which was published by Wired magazine.
My name is James Hall. I'm a pumpkin carver. I've won Halloween Wars twice and a number of online contests. Today I've been challenged to explain pumpkin carving in 13 levels of increasing complexity.
And now in this video, professional pumpkin carver James Hall, who's an American carver, basically goes through 13 stages of carving a pumpkin from easy to complex. There's some great advice in this video, but there are some things in there which I don't necessarily agree with James on, or have a slightly alternative view, shall we say. So what I wanted to do is highlight that video. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. I'll drop it down in the description. But then also pick up on some of the points and some of the things that I do differently. So the first point I wanted to pick up on is around drawing on the pumpkin.
Start by drawing the image on the pumpkin. Even for people that have been doing this a long time, that is always a good step.
If you're carving a basic pumpkin, I think that's fine. And if you're someone like Kim Jung-ji, who by the way is an awesome Korean artist who is famous for just being able to draw without construction lines or reference, feel free to go ahead and do that. For the rest of us mere mortals, that can be quite difficult. If you're drawing a face, you might use the Loomis or Riley methods, or if you might also start by drawing a very loose, light sketch of basic shapes and layer that picture up, adding detail for the further along you go. Now that's difficult to do on a pumpkin. Particularly if you're using a pen which requires acetone to remove, because then you're probably having to rub bits out, and then that makes the pen more difficult to reapply on top of that. So what I like to do is sketch my designs out on paper first when you get into the more complex stuff. So I'm like James is drawing a dragon straight onto the pumpkin. He's going to carve a dragon. So I'm going to draw and carve a dragon as well, except I'm going to sketch my dragon out on paper first. What I'm then going to do is take that sketch and turn it into a stencil just by cutting it out, flip that over. I'll then colour in the back with a pencil, stick it to my pumpkin and draw over it with a ballpoint pen. That will then press the graphite onto the pumpkin, and it'll be the final design without the need to obviously doing all the sketch onto the pumpkin. I think if you are doing more complex designs, that's probably an easier way to go. The drawing is the foundation to your pumpkin carving. So if you've got a very messy, basic drawing, your carving is likely to be very messy and basic as well. But if you have took the time to make a detailed design on paper first and turn that into a stencil, then you're probably going to end up being much happier with the carve, and it's probably going to be a bit easier to carve as well, because you've got a plan. You know exactly what you're doing when you go at it. So tools. James is using loop tools for his pumpkin carvings, which rather impressively he's actually made himself, but you can buy them. As James says in the video, you'll probably need to sharpen up the ready bought ones, which are clay loop tools used for sculpting clay primarily. They are what sort of pumpkin sculptors tend to favour, which is one of the types of pumpkin carvings I'll talk about a little bit later on in the video. I prefer to use lino cutters or gouges, as some people call them, which are sort of just little V-shaped attachments which you can shave off the pumpkin flesh. I'll then also use wood carving chisels, which have a range of different shapes and sizes to sink deeper into the pumpkin to add the highlights onto the designs. For my dragon, I'm just going to use the tools I'm most comfortable with. I'm going to start off by skimming over the design with one of the smaller V attachment gouges first, and then to add some of the highlights, I'm going to start going over that with all the various shaped chisels which I've got in my collection, just to sort of sink deeper into that to add the highlights. But again, you know, the tools are really just down to personal preference. I prefer to use those types of gouges. I think they suit my style of carving a little bit better. But, you know, it's really down to personal preference. I've seen people use, you know, Dremels or rotary tools and achieve some fantastic results. The same with the loop tools. You know, you can use them to do pumpkin shading and sculpting. I would encourage anyone to try as many different tools as you can, experiment with them, and just find something which works for you. So next, I was wanting to just take a quick look at the overall structure of the video. This sort of listing from easy to complex. I'm well aware that Wired would have given James a brief, and he's had to work to that brief, which is why he's done it as a 13 levels of carving. Looking on Wired's channel, they do a lot of this listicle type stuff. However, I think that, you know, that is slightly different to how I would explain it. Broadly speaking, when I'm talking to people, I think you can fit pumpkin carving into 3 different categories, or 3 types of pumpkin carving. The first is what most people are familiar with, which is cutout, where you're just cutting blocks out of the pumpkin to create, you know, like the traditional jack-o'-lantern face that you see a lot of. The second type is sculpting, which is what James specializes in, which is where you're treating the pumpkin the same way you would a piece of wood or clay, and you're just sculpting it into a 3D image. And then there's what I specialize in, which is what this is behind me here, which is pumpkin surface carving, shading, etching. Different people call it different things, and that is essentially where you're only shaving off thin layers of the pumpkin and cutting down to different depths, and once you illuminate it, it's letting the various amounts of light through to create the design. So you can see here on the brighter parts, I've basically gone slightly deeper into the pumpkin, and then on the darker parts, I've hardly shaved the pumpkin off at all. So, you know, the way I see it is, you know, most pumpkin carvings will fit into those 3 categories. I just wanted to explain that because he starts off with some of the basic methods of being the cutout, then he progresses onto some shading techniques, and then he progresses onto sculpting. So I think James does some of the other styles a bit of a disservice here. I think there are easy to advanced carves within each of those 3 categories. So you could have a basic cutout carve and an advanced cutout carve, and you know, there's a whole range of different skill sets and techniques throughout that. The same with pumpkin shading, as I like to call it, and you know, the same with sculpting as well. So in level 3 in the video, James moves on to what he calls realistic pumpkin carving, which is starting to sort of explore the sort of shading technique, which I specialize in.
Instead of just carving a triangle and saying that's an eye, you're going to be carving the shapes that light makes when it bounces off an object. One of the other things you have to draw out with a marker first is highlights. Pick a source. If you have a face and the light is supposed to be coming from the right side, you're going to be carving out like a spot here and a spot here. Even if it's something imaginary, light still bounces off pretty much the same way.
So this is basically looking at Lambert's law of emission, which is the law of how light interacts with objects. So imagine every object broken down into basic planes, with each one of those planes having a different angle to the light source. So imagine brightness on a scale, whereby if you have a surface pointing directly at the light, that's at 100% brightness, because you know the most amount of light is hitting that. As you rotate that 90 degrees, that falls into shade, and that will then be at 0% brightness, or you know, completely in the shadow. What would happen then if you was to rotate that angle to an 80-degree angle? A lot of people intuitively think that the brightness will increase by you know, just 20%, when in actual fact Lambert's law of emission, the brightness increases to 45%, so a dramatic jump for just a small rotation towards the light source. And it's that people often will get wrong. They will look at shading more sort of in a linear pattern, when in fact there's a much more dramatic rise in that sort of between 90 and sort of 80% is where most of the increase happens, and then it's a very, very gradual increase as you rotate round. So why am I really labouring this point to you? Well, I think this is the single most important principle in pumpkin shading and being able to achieve a realistic pumpkin carving. What I haven't really covered in this video are things like secondary light sources, reflected light and perspective, which are things I will go into more detail on in another video. Now, I've by no means mastered some of these principles. It's something which I'm continuing to work on myself, but hopefully by you starting to think about these things like I did, you'll start to see quite a dramatic improvement in your pumpkin shading. So later on in the video, James really starts to flex his sculpting skills. And you know, he produces some mind-blowing work here. You know, I particularly love the guy in the armor where he's using some animatronics to move it. You know, there's no doubt that James is very skillful at sculpting a pumpkin. In the planning of this video has really inspired me to have a go at doing my own sculpting. When I first started carving, I had a little go at some sculpting, but very quickly discovered that I just much prefer the shading technique. So that's something that I ran with. So I never really went back to sculpting. I just continued with the shading technique. However, I wanted to have a little go at something for this video. So I'm going to carve a very basic face, you know, a bit of a caricature-y face, you know, using some of the advice which James has given, and you know, hopefully some of the knowledge which I already have about shape and form. I'm going to carve just a basic face. I'm not going to go for anything which is realistic here. You know, realism is difficult to achieve in anything. So what I'm going to start off with is a very, like almost like a caricature face. He's going to have big goofy teeth and eyes and nose. You know, I'm not going to go into loads of detail on it. Now I'm going to start off by just mapping out where I want the features to be with a pen. And then I'm going to use my wood carving chisels, and I'm going to start to sink into the pumpkin on the areas which I know are going to be deepest. So the nose is, the tip of the nose is always going to be where the outer edge of the pumpkin is. So I'm going to sink everything back to give it that form, starting off with either side of the bridge of the nose where the corner of the eye sockets are, and then I'm going to work outwards from there. I must say I really enjoyed carving this pumpkin. It's, you know, something which was outside of my comfort zone. I'm definitely going to do more sculpting in the future. I wasn't particularly happy with the eyes and how they turned out, so that's something which I'm going to work on whilst practicing this method of pumpkin carving. But you know, I really enjoyed James's video, and you know, I think there's some good advice in there. I'd encourage you to go and check that out and show James some love. You know, he is a fantastic artist. Hopefully I've elaborated on some of the points which James has touched on and offered an alternative view on some of the stuff also. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, give it a like for me. It helps the algorithm spread it to more people, and you know, consider subscribing if you're not already, and I'll see you in the next one.